I need everybody to stand up. All right. First and foremost, we want to give thanks to everyone that made this event happen, right? So I want you to go, turn around, look to the team behind you, and give a round of applause. All right. Sweet. All right. Pablo. So we're supposed to be talking about branding today, right? So if you've ever experienced me educate anyone before, go ahead and raise your hands. Okay? Not bad. We need to work on that a little bit. So if you get anything that's inspirational from me today, that's good. If you get anything that's motivational from me, that's good as well. If you take action from what I'm telling you to do today, that's when I'm going to say fuck yes, right? Because I want you to take action. I don't want you to sit in this fucking room and write down notes and they become toilet paper later on, right? We're not here for the bullshit. We're here to take actions on our steps and get results. All right, so let's get into it. If we can get this fucker to work. Warning. Those that know me know that I probably got a bad case of Tourette's. Hence why I'm at the Badass Summit, right? So today we're going to have fun. We're going to talk shit. We're going to talk about sex because, what's branding without sex? Branding has to be sexy. You can't, sex sells everything, right? So we're going to talk about sex and we're going to, again, take action on our knowledge, right? Next slide. What are we going to cover today? So the first thing we're going to talk about is foreshadowing, right? So there's multiple definitions of foreshadowing. We're going to go into that. We're going to talk about partnerships and co-branding. We're going to talk about successful rebranding. And we're also going to talk about legacy brand building. All of these are just bullshit words to really talk about the functionalities of the three parts of branding that you're going to need to understand, to comprehend, to get the best results with your business and your growth strategies. Then we're going to go over a key takeaway. Then we're going to do take actions and then the next steps. So let's go into the next slide. All right. Foreshadowing. And as you're looking at these images, you're probably saying, like, what the fuck do these images have to do with anything related to branding whatsoever? What do these images have to do with essay speech? Well, I'm going to make a promise to you. By the end of this speech, we'll be able to transition from 6 random fuck-ass images into an actual clear statement of branding. Okay? Is that fair enough? That's a promise that I'm going to make to you guys. The real definition of foreshadowing is listed on the bottom left. But I like to look at it as more so, if you're going to foreshadow something, you need to think about what's the end result in mind. With the end result in mind, that's what your brand strategy is going to be. So you're going to make a promise to your consumers or to your clients. All right. So when I think about branding and co-branding, you could call me a freak if you want to. I'm okay with that. I look at branding and co-branding much like relationships. Much like if I'm going to have sex with someone, much like if I'm going to make that person into a partner, right? And I'm gonna give you like a prime example. Like when I first met Donnie and I saw his brand and I was like, okay, badass. Does that shit make sense with Boss Uncaged? Can I say badass, Boss Uncaged in a sentence? Yeah. Now you see why the fuck I'm on the stage, right? Because it makes sense. You have to have these strategies in place. I want you to look around everybody in this room. Every single person in this room, if you don't have a logo, if you don't have a brand, you're fucked up and you need to get one, right? And that's what the goal of this presentation is, to help you on that track to get one. But, the but is I want you to look to people around you and figure out the commonalities between each other. And it may be a stretch. You may have to open up your mind a little bit, right? You may have to think out the box. Because at first glance, you may not realize that there's commonalities between you. So when you're thinking about co-branding, there's attraction, there's reality, right? Attraction, I look at that as, they look good on paper. Everyone always looks good on fucking paper. Everyone's resume looks good on paper. But who are they really? That's the reality. In business, that's considered to be the discovery stage. So you're gonna find someone, you're gonna go through the reality, you're gonna look behind the paperwork, you're gonna kind of see if they're really who they say they are. The commitment, well, that's in business the proposal or the SOW, right? Then there's intimacy. That's the topic that I like to talk about. Signing the contract. That's when you essentially get the paycheck, right? That's the money shot. That's when shit becomes sexy, is when you deposit that damn check in the bank, right? Then after that is the engagement, collaboration. Obviously, their team has to work with your team. Then there's the baby, co-branding, and that's what we're gonna talk about, right? How do we co-brand two separate brands and to make one cohesive brand to make it work? Last but not least, parenting. Well, if you're gonna have sex and you're gonna make babies, you're gonna have to figure out how to parent these kids together, right? So you're talking about two separate personalities, two separate businesses, two separate parents working together in uniform to make the best effort to grow that child to become a successful business. The next slide is when we're gonna have some fun. If we can get that to work. All right, you see the O face? Now I want everyone here to go ahead and practice your O face, okay? Don't be bashful. Practice your O face. Because again, your O face is what you should feel when you get that check, when you make that deposit, when you make that partnership, right? You're gonna have to figure out these celebrations. If you're embarrassed to make your O face right now, then what are you gonna do when you go to collect that check? You have to learn how to make your O face at any given time. You could ask my wife, I'll come out the damn bathroom butt ass naked and make O faces all the damn time because I'm signing those damn contracts. She's got put on the spot. Let's get to the next slide.
She is the boss.
All right, so this is where we get to the more conceptual, right? Everyone, if you don't know Oprah, I feel sorry for you, right? But obviously Oprah is the queen of media, right? She is an American talk show host. She is a philanthropist. She's all these different things. She's also a multi-billionaire. But what would her brand look like with another brand? What would that other brand be? So I'm gonna do a hypothetical. So if I went to Oprah as a growth strategist and said, okay, I think a good brand for you would be to get into the food. And everybody's like, why the fuck would Oprah get into food? What does Oprah have to do with food? But I'm like, okay, well, just think about it from this standpoint. What would be a good company? Well, keep looking. Honeycomb, right? So I want you to think about Honeycomb from a brand standpoint. Honeycomb has a legacy of making characters, right? They sell their products to kids, right? Oprah definitely has multiple different brand assets underneath her belt, but what would it look like if Oprah had a baby with Honeycomb? What would that baby look like? And I want you to kind of visually think about that. What would the queen of media look like with Honeycomb as a co-branded company? Queen bee, right? So think of it as a game. You have to understand that you're playing a game of business around the clock. So if I'm presenting this to her, I'm like, well, what's gonna make it work for Oprah? What's gonna make it work for Honeycomb? Well, these four bullets at the bottom right, right? Well, Oprah's in the TV. We could leverage that. Honeycomb is a honey product. We could leverage that. Percentages of the proceed will go to education, which obviously she's a philanthropist. We could leverage that. And then last but not least, what would it look like to create a new character for Honeycomb? Now, this is all hypothetical. This is not a real world example. So what would a real world example look like? What does real world co-branding look like? And again, I want you guys to think about it. You're in a room with multiple different brands. How are you going to mix these brands between yourselves and figure out how to create a new corporation or a new company or a new business venture? We're all familiar with Kanye West. He's probably one of the most interesting people in music today, right? Well, think about what he's done with the industry. Who has he partnered with? Adidas. Now, you're probably thinking, like, what the hell does Adidas and Kanye West have to do with each other, right? Well, I look at this as collecting checks for child support, right? Both of them are essentially parents of two separate brands, and they work together to create one brand, right? But in the long term, obviously, they're not going to always stay co-branded. They're going to create this product, and they may move on and do other things. So let's look at that co-brand. Now, if you look at that number, it's $191 million of a child support check that he got from Adidas in 2020. Now, I want you to think about that. If he did not co-brand with Adidas, would he have gotten that child support check? All right? Let's slide on. So I always make a smart-ass remark about everyone is having babies and creating fun coupons. And as you can see this list as it continues to unfold, every single one of these are live examples of co-branded companies. Some of them are like, I would have never have believed that McDonald's and Burger King would have partnered, but they have. So think about why these companies do these things. And all these companies are essentially hundreds of millions, billion-dollar corporations, but they have strategized to where they've co-branded in multiple different facets of their business to promote a particular product or a particular service. And that particular product or service then multiplies between their both target audiences. They're talking to two separate communities of people, and they're co-branding it to make that work and happen for them. So again, look around the tables of where you at and start thinking about, who am I going to co-brand with? Who am I going to co-partner with? Because that's where the real money comes into play. Prime example, again, I'm on the stage because Boss Uncaged and Badass makes sense. I can co-brand that. Donnie can co-brand that. If this was like some other name, a random name, it would not have worked as well for my brand, and it probably wouldn't have worked as well for Donnie, and that's what you want no matter what you're doing. All right. Revive. So revive, as it's defined, it's, bringing things back to life, bringing it back to health. And I'm a real big guy on consolidating things and making it smaller and shorter. So revive is one aspect of it. But what's the shorter version of revive? Well, it's rev. And what's the definition of rev? It means to accelerate, right? And if you're in this room, I would think by default, everyone wants to accelerate something. Everyone wants to grow. Everyone wants to expand. Everyone wants to become larger or make more capital. So a quick takeaway for Rev, it's reuse and repeat. Everyone in here at some time or the other has worked for someone, and you've seen different systems in play. You don't have to use all the systems. You just have to take the systems that you've seen work, the systems that have benefited the company you work for or the company that you have created. You want to take that and then recreate that into your system, right? E is ecosystems. You want to create and develop ecosystems. Again, everyone in this particular summit, we've talked about systems throughout, whether it was Kevin Snow talking about automation systems, but systems are the backbone to any business. If you cannot recreate what you're doing, then you're pretty much working for yourself and you're gonna work yourself to death. So you want to create an ecosystem that works for you, whether you're asleep or not. Then last but not least is deliver and over-deliver value, okay? You could have the first two, but without delivering the value, then you're gonna essentially lose your customers and lose your clientele because, again, if you're not delivering what they're asking for, they're not gonna come back. Next slide. So this is a weird slide. It's kind of like, what does Rev have to do with rest in peace? And you can see there's a random ass coffin, and I like this gift because every time I look at it, it kind of reminds me of like what death could be like in that process. So when we're talking about rest in peace, like Cerebral 360, that's my first company. It's still there. It's still like my underground. I always put it behind the scenes. I don't give it any credit due because I kind of despise it to a certain extent, right? The reason why I despise it because I created it while I was in college in early 2000. I built it up to where I had multiple employees. Things were systematic. Things were running, but I was working 20 hours a day, probably 24 hours a day sometimes, and constantly keep working. So as my story goes, I always say that my parents kidnapped me from Brooklyn as a graffiti artist, dragged me to Atlanta. And in Atlanta, they said, what the fuck am I gonna do with this kid? They put me in art school. Art school was cool. Then I graduated. I was like, what the fuck am I gonna do with a graphic design degree? How do I make money doing this? Then from that, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a dumbass and go back to school and get another degree in web design and multimedia. I did that, and I graduated with that, and I was like, great, now I got 2 fuck-ass degrees. What the hell am I supposed to do with these? How do I make money with these 2 different degrees? And that's when it dawned on me that I was both creative and analytical. And the reason why I kept going back for more is because I was looking for my analytical side, but I was feeding my creative side. So I went on this journey to start feeding it. I became a travel agent. I became an insurance agent. I got my Series 6. I started infiltrating several different companies. I worked for Comcast for 30 days. I worked for this other company for 30 days. I literally was just getting random jobs just to learn their systems. At the same time, I was going through a divorce, a custody battle. I got awarded full primary custody of my son, which is hard as fuck for a guy to do if you didn't know. And I was growing my company all at the same time. Fast forward to 2018, unfortunately, all of that shit added up to where I had a stroke. And I was like, Interesting. So the last thing I remember before I woke up in the hospital is I saw the halo lights. And I was like, oh, this is what the hell they talk about when you see like the lights before you pass away, all this other bullshit. I'm like, this is interesting. The next day I woke up, I made it through. My son was in the room. My parents was in the room. My girlfriend, who is my current wife now, was in the room as well. And I woke up with like fire. I woke up because I wanted to say, okay, I left behind something. Now, I left behind a bank account, I left behind a business, but what was the legacy that I was going to leave behind? And that's when we come to the rebranding. Because at that moment, I realized that I branded myself into a hole. I branded myself into the wrong business structure, and you have to let go. Hence why, let that shit rest in peace. If you're holding on to a brand currently right now that does not suit you and your lifestyle and what you want to do, and you're overworking yourself to fucking death, well, then the person you need to choose to die is either going to be that company or yourself. 2018, it took me essentially 6 to 9 months to recover. I had to go through different things as far as recovering from, well, you don't realize it until you have a stroke that depression becomes the real fucking thing. Up until that point, I didn't even know what the definition of that shit was. So once I got hit with that level of depression, I was like, okay, how do I overcome this? What do I do to push through this? What do I leave behind for my family? What breadcrumbs do I leave behind? So I rebranded myself as S.A. Grant versus Chanel. Cerebral 360 is still there. And then I did what I'm telling you guys to do, is co-brand. So I internally co-brand into where I created Boss Uncaged. So now Boss Uncaged it's an easier name to remember than Cerebral 360. It's sure as fuck a lot easier to spell than Cerebral 360. The definition of it is a lot easier to remember what the functionality of it is. So hence why there's 2 separate brands. But let's move forward. Celebrating your victories. Okay? So from 2020 to 2021 is when I started Boss Uncaged. I literally just started it in February of 2020. It took me about a year to recover from the stroke and then kind of figure out what my next move were. What was I going to leave behind as far as the legacy? How am I going to leave behind breadcrumbs? So I decided to educate entrepreneurs and tell them exactly my story, but also educate them on the processes that I have learned in the past 21 years that had made Cerebral 360 effective, but killed me in the damn process. So if you don't mind, I would like everyone to stand up. Now, I've seen the little laughs and the little chuckles, and you was looking at the video, right? Because we want to celebrate your victory. So if you're here in this room right now, this is the victory. This is the first step to your next step. So DJ, I want you guys to go ahead. Thrust it. Get it. You gotta have a serious face though. Your face, you can't smile. You gotta be serious with this shit. Celebrate the fucking victory. Sweet. Creating your brand legacy by leaving breadcrumbs, right? So if nothing else, that should be ingrained in your fucking minds after this presentation, right? You want to make sure you celebrate those damn victories. And again, my wife could attest to it. I'll come out the damn shower butt-ass naked doing that shit, celebrating the damn victory, okay? All right, so we're talking about like legacy branding, right? Legacy brand building. Obviously, I've told you guys stories today. That's the only thing that I've done. So what is your story? What is your brand story? What is your company story? What is the story of your product, the story of your service, your client stories? If you cannot tell these stories, it's probably why you're not making the money that you want to make. You want to influence people, but the best way to influence people is to communicate with them. Not everyone in this room is going to be the right person for you, but if you find 1 or 2 people, and they have 1 or 2 people, the compounding effect will happen. So the goal is you don't want to find everyone, you want to find the right one. So, what does it look like when a brand becomes a cult? Well, think about it, right? Donnie has built Badass to an extent to where it's kind of like a cult following because he's done his branding correctly, right? Everyone is walking around rocking his brand, sharing his communication. That's the dawn of what a cult brand looks like. And I'm not saying cult in a negative context. As the next slide, you will see the positives of developing a cult brand. There we go. Well, I'm sure we're all familiar with this bastard on the left. Some of you love him. Some of you hate him. But at the end of all, when he died, he was worth $10+ billion. Then his company's story and his company brand, secondary to him, I would say at least half the room probably has an iPhone or some kind of Apple device, right? But the beauty is that him as an owner, right? Steve Jobs has his own story. Steve Jobs' story is a publicly known thing. So if you have not heard Steve Jobs' story, I would say recommend do that because that story falls into the brand of Apple. Then Apple's story then takes off where Steve left off. And then now we have the product brands, which is the iPhone. Now the iPhone, if you look at the revenue numbers, the iPhone is essentially half the revenue of the entire company. Now mind you, they're not a phone company. There never was a phone company. So how does a company go from creating computers to developing phones to becoming half of their revenue share, right? And to the point to where people will stand outside overnight in the cold waiting for a device that's worth $1,000 versus just going to Best Buy and picking up a Samsung or something else. So I want you to think about that. That's what I'm saying with cult following. This is what I mean. Last but not least is their services. And if you look at these bullets on the bottom right, like all their services are well into the $1 billion. So when you're talking about legacy branding, building up a cult, you want to think about these 4 things. Your personal story, your company story, your product story, and your service story. If you're missing any one of these elements, you probably want to think about how do I develop these. And again, everyone in this room should have at least, I would say, 3 out of that 4. You may have a product, you may have a service, but I'm sure as hell you have your own personal story, and I'm sure your companies have their story. So if you cannot identify what your company stories are, what your personal stories are, and what your product stories are, that's a hurdle that you need to overcome. All right, storytelling, right? So we're talking about being a cult and understanding branding. So this is a packet of Chick-fil-A sauce from my fridge at my house, okay? So my crazy-ass son wrote this messaging on this Chick-fil-A packet where he was making threats to the animals of the house if his packet was to be used other by himself, which when you think about it is crazy as shit because it was on top of another packet on top of a bottle of the sauce. I want you to picture this shit, right? But then I'm looking like, okay, first I laughed and I was like, well, this is a good opportunity for branding because again, Chick-fil-A is one of those brands that they're closed on Sundays and they have this legacy behind them. They have a cult fucking following as well. But then what do they do with the revenue, right? So if you look at that top bullet, that's the shit that surprised me. Well, their revenue shares of this, the actual sauce went through the roof in 2020, and they took some of the proceeds of that and gave it back as scholarships. Now, mind you, if that brand didn't exist, if someone in that company did not say, hey, we have an opportunity to take our sauces independently from our corporation brand and create a sub-brand, where would that money be? In addition to that, if you look at their quarterly revenue from 2020, right, $38 million from sauce. And I want you to put that into scope. That's 1 quarter. What would it look like for you to get 1 quarter worth of almost $40 million off of a product? So my next question is, did anybody in here join a cult? I'm sure as these brands start to unfold, maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, but all of these brands essentially are, I would deem them as cult brands for obvious reasons, right? Amazon by itself, number 7, that's a monster. And I'm sure everyone in here has either bought something from them, whether you like Beso or not, or you have Prime, or whatever it is. But again, understanding that you're part of a cult, so leverage that. Look at these as systems and replicate what they're doing. Remember what I said about Rev, is you need to figure out what's working and then start to repeat what's working to get the best results. Because again, if it's working, you don't have to recreate it. You just have to use it. Next slide. Something.
I know.
All right. Key takeaways. Partnerships and co-branding, right? So first and foremost, I want everyone to start brand dating. So the goal of this is obviously if you have not got everyone's business cards, if you have not linked up with people on Instagram and Twitter, I would advise you to do that before. Oh, the LinkedIn boss said LinkedIn. Okay? Sorry, LinkedIn boss. Make sure that before you leave, right, you came here not just for the education, you came here for the networking. So if you're not networking and you're not co-branding and collaborating with people, then you're completely fucking up. I'm just being honest with you. Second to that is then you want to start thinking about, like, what does a brand baby look like? And again, I'm going back to the sex side of it. If I'm looking at somebody, if I'm attracted to them, right? Again, if they look good on paper and all the things line up, then the next step is I'm probably going to get in bed with them, maybe, right? And then the side effect of that is probably going to be a baby, right? So you just want to understand that. If you're going to look at a brand, you want to make sure that that brand baby is going to be a baby that you can utilize for both parties. Successful rebranding, right? So we talk about reuse what worked, repeat it, create and deliver ecosystems, deliver value. And again, more value, the better. And value doesn't mean you have to break a sweat to do it. You just have to give the information that you know that someone else does not know. Legacy building is going into brand stories. And I think out of everything I've said today, the brand stories are probably like the most thing that you need to take away. And I'm going to give you some action items to actually build your brand stories. Get to the next slide. This clicker does not like me at all. I don't think it likes anybody up here. There it is.
So did we have a one-night stand? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Something like that. Did I celebrate? So, at the end of all that, right, you got to make sure you celebrate. Again, I'm just going to recap that. You got to celebrate. You got to take action. I'm just saying. Again, if you're feeling uncomfortable, you need to feel uncomfortable. If you don't feel uncomfortable, then you're stagnant. And if you're stagnant, you're not growing, right? I always heard about this Jewish proverb about lobsters. And the reason why lobsters grow is because they become completely uncomfortable in the shells that they're in. If they're not uncomfortable, then they won't grow. We're talking about growth strategy. So everything I'm saying, I am fucking with your psyche to make you understand that if you're not where you need to be, then you need to get there, and you're going to be uncomfortable on that journey of getting to that process. Looking at Jesus lick a ball over and over again. There it is. All right, so step one of the key takeaway steps, right? One, if you don't know who the face of your company is, unfortunately, that becomes you today, right? You need to define the face of your company. Number two, this is a podcast question that I always ask my guests. Define yourself in 3 to 5 words, right? So this 3 to 5 words, it consolidates. You don't need to tell a long, drawn-out fucking story. 3 to 5 words, right? What is your best 3 to 5 words to define you? Become a time traveler, right? It's another question to ask in my podcast. If you can go back in time, what is one thing that you would want to tell your younger self to change the outcome of where you are to make it happen a lot faster? And I want you to really think about that question. Put that into your story. Take the combination of these 3, create a formula for telling your personal stories, and then by all means, start telling your story. Start telling your story. The more you tell your story is the more you're going to give people opportunities to connect with you, to know who you are, to think about who could you have a baby with, brand baby in that case. And yes, there's more. All right. Number 2, Company brand story. What is your company story? Another question I ask on my podcast is that we've always hear about the 20 years it takes someone to become a success story and is perceived to be an overnight success. How long did it take you or your company to get to where it is currently? Okay? That is a key part of telling your story because you're going to tell your journey of your hurdles and what you've overcame. What is the problem that you solve? I mean, that's everyone here should know what problem you solve. If you don't know what problem you're solving, then you maybe want to go back to the drawing board and figure out what product or services am I giving to a community of people, but if I'm not solving a problem, then why are they buying it, right? And what's your most significant achievement to date? So if you're talking about achievements, again, your company could be an achievement, right? Your personal achievement, again, you're just building the building blocks of being able to tell your personal story with your company story. And by all means, tell that story over and over again. And again, I'm telling you guys this because there's 3 steps. If you just take action on one of them, okay? Let's get to step number 3.
You really like that movie, don't you? Big Lebowski?
Just on occasion.
Maybe if you make your own face.
On my old face? All right, developing the products and services, right? So this one is personify your products and services. You've probably seen it a million times but didn't recognize it, right? Name your products and services. Don't give them serial numbers. Don't make it number 3, number 4. Give it a name. You're naming your baby, right? So think about your community of audience. What's the product or services going to help them, and give it a name that can relate to that audience. And again, you've seen it a million different times. Figure out the naming of your baby before you bring that baby to life. Number 2, where do you see that product or service in 20 years from now? Because again, you're going to have that scope of work. And I'm not talking about the end result. I'm talking about where do you see you are now, the birth of that child, and where is that child going to be 20 years from now? Much like if you have kids, you want to see that child be successful. You're going to put that foundation in. You're going to grow and nurture it. So again, 20 years from now, I would like to see my son become blah, blah, blah. Well, same thing for your products and services. 20 years from now, I would like my product to become whatever it is you want it to become. Or maybe you want to sell that and get rid of it, you know? Sometimes we feel like that with our kids. So, shit happens. Last but not least is number 5. If you met your product or service in a bar, could you have a conversation with it? Again, we're personifying it, right? So think about your product or service. If your product or service is a boring product or service, then when you start to talk to someone about that product or service, they're probably going to view it as being boring as hell as well. So think about that. You're giving it a name, you're personifying it, you're bringing it to life, and then put that product or service in a bar. Think about how would it do, all right? And obviously I want you guys to talk about it, tell stories about it, communicate about it. Slide number. All right. So this is the part where I made the promise, right? The promise in the beginning. Did you forget about the promise? The foreshadowing promise? Dirty mind. So if you don't mind, I want everyone to stand up. And as the picture says, I want you to say it with your chest. We're going to read these slides, right? And we're going to say it like we mean it, right? For the dudes, we're going to reach deep down, right? For the gals, you're going to resonate. Let's get to the next slide. This is when technology is not your friend, and I'm the tech guy. All right. A badass motherfucker named Essay taught kick-ass brand strategies. I will take massive action. I'm a boss uncaged. After you. Thank you. All right. So obviously, there's probably going to be questions, and if there are any questions, by all means, scan the QR code. I already have it pre-set up to do a live continued breakout session afterwards. It's probably gonna be a week from now. So it gives you time to kind of get that homework done, those 3 slides about fill in the blanks. Thank you.